today, the Bible and mountain. Uh, it's a fun kind of thing to think about how many mountains the Bible talks about, uh, and it's just an interesting kind of a piece here to see what all is there and how many mountains. It's interesting to look at them. Um, the mountains are real. Come in, come in, come in. Uh, the mountains that are identified in the Bible are real mountains. They're there. That's historical, and so we'll be talking about that. The events that the Bible remembers about these mountains is another story. I mean, those are stories. Uh, I look at those as as windows, if you please, windows into maybe the Spirit of God, windows into what was happening at a particular time. Um, some people take all of those absolutely literally. My word is, I take the Bible with utmost seriousness, but not in every instance literally. But that's just the way that I do it. And so what I talk about trying to do is to get inside the story, get inside whatever the narrative of the Bible might be, with the keen kind of appreciation of what was going on. So, and I did it chronologically, and thinking about it later, I missed one or two that we'll talk about, but nonetheless, it's a fascinating study. The first one that pops up is Mount Ararat, uh, and Mount Ararat is identified with the flood of Noah. Uh, when you begin to poke around in ancient history, uh, in so many cultures, in so many places, catastrophic flood stories pop up. I was looking at my news feed today on my phone here and on my iPad, and some parts of Africa are absolutely destroyed with floods. And we've just had a whole round of floods in North Carolina. Uh, the little creeks that had been meandering through the towns and villages for decades suddenly, with Helena, jumped the banks, and we had all of those horrible floods. So the story of Noah and the flood in the book of Genesis, I think, comes out of that milieu of floods. And what the Hebrew writers did, the scribes who put these things together, uh, they picked the stories that had floated in for generations and eons, and they gave them a theological bent. The writers of the Hebrew Bible, uh, we talked about that some. That is another whole fascinating study. Took the bits and pieces from their distant past and wove them together to make some points. And so I think the flood story is another one of those uh, points. We've talked in here before. The Bible was written by people. Sometimes we think it might have just dropped down out of heaven, but it was written by people, and it was always written with an agenda. They had a reason for writing what they wrote. Uh, and you could go at the flood story from many angles. Um, the way the Bible unfolds with that, God had made humanity, and then humanity began to act stupid and evil. And the Bible says God was sorry that he made us. Well, I, I think that is poetry rather than history. Nobody knows what God thinks, and certainly not to be able to write it down or put it in a book like that. Um, but anyway, that was the understanding. And then the flood comes. Uh, and the the Hebrew writers, the Israelite scribes, told the story because everybody had a flood story. Everybody, all around them, they had flood stories. So the Hebrew writers, I think, took the flood stories, and some of the people about whom they wrote might have had floods themselves, and it was very common. And they wanted to make a point with the flood story. Uh, Number one, I think they wanted to, and this is me supposing, the Hebrew writers wanted to make the point in their era that God is in control of all of this. God is omnipotent. God is all powerful. They wanted to make the point that God is in control of all of this. Uh, but they also wanted to make the point that even though God might have been, quote, mad at us, that God was not done with us yet. And so what the Hebrew writers did, as you well know, they they said, okay, we've had floods. Is God mad at us? What's happening here? Uh, is God trying to wipe us all out? Is God so disgusted with us that he's trying to wipe us all out? No. He may be wiping a lot of us out, but he's still going to save some of us. And so that's the story of the ark. He told Noah how to build the ark and put all the animals two by two into the ark. And so when the waters came, the humanity in this sense and a lot of the world's animals were saved. And that is the Hebrew writer's way of saying that God is still gracious. God is in this, it's not my understanding of God, but this is the Hebrew understanding of God, that God was angry, God was wrathful, the ancient gods got mad at people. So God was angry, God was going to do a cleanup, but he wasn't through with us yet. And so the way the Israelites told the story, humanity had made a mess, all kinds of stuff there. But God was going to clean up his act. He was sorry he did it, going to clean up, but he was going to start again. Uh, and so this is the ark and Noah and all like that. Uh, but he wasn't done that yet. The rains came in one account, 40 days and 40 nights. Another account, other parts of Genesis, 100 or so days. And how long did it last? But the bottom line is that God showed grace. And the way that God showed grace was in one thing, it quit raining. The floods, the waters receded, the waters finally dried up. And then in the Bible tells it, God sent the rainbow. Now we know that rainbow is a part of nature, but the ancients did not know that, and as the floods receded, and it came the beautiful rainbow, and so the Israelites said, "This is a way to show God's grace and God's love and God's endurance with us." And the point of Ararat, uh, the Bible says that the ark settled, landed uh, in the mountains, plural, mountains of Ararat. So, what's Ararat? Ararat is a range of mountains in Turkey today. So much of that world was belonged to Turkey. Uh, so it was in Turkey on the borders there, and it's a big range of mountains, and who knows where. But the way the Bible tells the story is the ark landed on Ararat. Where on Ararat, nobody knows. It's a big range of mountains. Uh, anyway, that's where that is. Um, a few years ago, maybe 25, I don't remember, I lost track of it. One of our astronauts, whose name I didn't try to look up, decided he's a man of great faith. Uh, he decided that he was going to mount an expedition to the mountains of Ararat because somewhere up in those mountains there is a rock formation that could look like the remnants of a ship. So it's a rock formation like that. And this astronaut, I guess at his own expense or raised money for it, he went out there to try to determine where the ark finally settled. Uh, I don't know what he wound up doing. He bit off more than he could chew because it's a huge range of mountains there. And I don't know exactly what that rock formation was. Probably it didn't quite happen like that. The the Bible wants to say, I think the story of the flood in Mount Ararat and all it is to say we humans make a mess. We all could go around the room today and talk about the messes that we've made of our lives. God are in the with the messes have consequences. You don't want to say God zapped you, but anyway, that's some people think that if you do bad, God does bad to you. I don't think so. But there's hope. So I think the story of Noah and the flood is the story of hope. It is the story of grace. It is the story that things are not always as they seem. I think that's the way that is. But the Bible says the ark settled on the mountains, plural, of Ararat. So that's one of the mountains. Is that okay? That uh, I do not believe, I mean, it's not mine to decide, but I do not think that it is a literal story. I think it is a beautiful story of justice and hope uh, and the grace of God. And I think that's really what they were trying to tell. Uh, did the people in antiquity think that it was real? Probably so. We probably have a lot of people around us today who would insist that that is a literal story. And that is absolutely their privilege, of course, to do whatever they want to with it. I think it is more of a parable. I think it is a magnificent testimony to the grace of God, to God's willingness to give us a second chance. So the first mountain then that we look at, and I guess it's probably the first one in the Hebrew Bible, is the Mount Ararat. Okay? That okay with everybody? All right, the other one, the next one that I pick up is Sinai, Moses and Sinai. And again, this is a range of mountains. It is on the border of way southern parts of Israel and Egypt down there. It's down in that area down there. Um, and as the story here is, of course, it is uh, when the Hebrew children were able to get out of Egypt, the Hebrew story of the Exodus, they crossed the water, the Red Sea or some body of water, and wound up at the foot of Mount Sinai. And again, nobody knows which of the mountains in that part of the world there is actually Sinai. Other parts of the Bible always also call it Mount Horeb, Horeb or Sinai. Uh, and this is the mountain, and the story is told many in several different ways in in the first five books of the Bible, in the Torah, in the Pentateuch. Different sequences here, but the passage that I lifted up here is almost the minute the Hebrews got out of Egypt and sort of stopped in their trek. They were at the foot of this big mountain, and God tells Moses to go up the mountain, and God will give Moses the Ten Commandments. Now, that story is told again several times in the Hebrew Bible in early in early in the first five books of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah. The Torah is what most Jews know as the Bible. When we lived in Maryland, I got acquainted with a lot of Jewish people who lived in the place where we did. They were faithful Jews. Every Friday afternoon, we had Shabbat, a rabbi came in and we did a Shabbat service. They knew all of the Hebrew, uh, but they knew almost nothing of the Bible. It was fun and interesting to work with them and begin to point out stuff that's real well known among us Bible people that they had never heard about in the Bible. A few times we'd be reading along, and particularly one of them named Sheldon, who just passed away the other day, they said, Bob, where'd you get that? You know, where did you get that? And I said, Sheldon, it's right here in Exodus or Leviticus. No, 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 you made that up. And I said, no, here it is. Here's the chapter and the verse. And he said, I never saw it. I never did know it. Anyway, so Sinai, uh, and the story is, and it's the story of the Exodus and the giving of the Ten Commandments. That Moses goes up this mountain, and he has a conversation with God, and it unfolds several times. And in some places, it even says that God wrote the Ten Commandments with his finger, wrote on tablets of stone with his finger. Again, I sort of think it didn't quite happen that way, but some people believe it firmly, and that's perfectly okay. Uh, the Exodus uh, is the primary story of the Hebrew people, of the Jewish people. Um, if Easter, if the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Day is our primary story, and I think that is the primary story of Christianity is the resurrection of Jesus. The Exodus out of Egypt is the primary story of of the Jews to this day. Uh, 2 or 3 times in my life, I have been to a Seder. Probably Rita has been to a Seder. Have y'all been to Seders? And it is a reenactment of the Exodus. It is a meal, and from antiquity, they've had certain ingredients that they eat at that Seder meal. And what it's the herbs and the unleavened bread and the bitter wine, yogurt, yeah,
Cucumbers and stuff like that.
right. And as they eat, typically, if there's a child there, the child reads the story, or in some cases, the kid knows the story in Hebrew, and he or she can recite the story of what happened the night the death angel passed over, all of that. Uh, so Moses went up Mount Sinai, and the story is told again and again that he got the Ten Commandments while he's up there on the mountain. A lot of fascinating study has been done on that. Uh, a lot of people are saying that the Ten Commandments were refined by the ancient Hebrews, but they may go way, way back to the 2 or 3,000 BCE to the Code of Hammurabi, which is an ancient Babylonian kingdom that came and went in antiquity. But the Mount Sinai, the range of mountains there is beautiful and important. I've been there a long, long time ago. If you maybe travel much in Israel, maybe you got to go to Sinai, or what people think is Sinai. Uh, and by the 3rd century, there was somebody, one of the groups had built a monastery up on what I guess most people agree is Mount Sinai. So there's a monastery up there. There's a hospice up there. Uh, and somewhere in all of that is also Mount Nebo. Mount Nebo is the pinnacle, allegedly, where Moses stood looking across the Jordan into the promised land. And that's when God said, Moses, you have led the people to the river, but you cannot go in. Why couldn't he go in? uh, at some point, this is one of those little quirky stories. Uh, Something like at some point, the Hebrews were in the wilderness They had run out of water, and so God told Abraham that if he struck a certain rock, that water would come. Um, so Moses did that, but he didn't quite do it. Scientists should have looked it up. He didn't quite do it like he thought God told him to do it. Water came, but because he didn't do it right, he had offended God. And God, Yahweh, says, you cannot go into the promised land because you sinned. Um, I hope not. I hope that didn't quite happen like that. Anyway, but that story is beautiful because Moses died on Horeb, the way the Bible tells it, on Nebo, I mean, and God buried him. God buried him. Out of love and grace, God actually buried Moses. Now, beautiful stories there. All that, what had happened like that is another. I worked a long time ago. I worked for Jimmy Carter at the White House. I worked there the last 2 years of his administration. And among the many things that Jimmy Carter did was he worked this peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. And of all of the ins and outs of the Middle East, that peace treaty between Carter and Begin and Sadat still holds. That's another whole big story that I don't know all about it. But when they had a big battle between Israel and Egypt. If you've seen the movie, what is it? No, not who was uh, the female prime minister that smoked all the time of Israel. Anyway, it was a movie not too long ago. That in that war, it was the war between Israel and Egypt. Uh, and in that war, uh, the borders changed, and whereas Sinai had been in Egypt as a result of that war, they redrew the line, and Sinai was suddenly in Israel. Well, in working out the treaty, Carter and Begin and Sadat agreed that the line would yet be drawn again, so Sinai would be in Egypt. So, in effect, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt. They had a big ceremony for that. And one of the few times the president actually called me, he called and he said, we're sending this delegation, and I need you to give me two names to go to on that delegation for that ceremony when Sinai goes back to Egypt. And I named a man named Demas Shakarian, who was head of a big layman's Bible fellowship sort of thing. And I also named the Episcopal bishop of Washington D.C., Bishop Walker. Anyway, so and when they came back, they brought me looked like a little cigar box, but it was a little uh, inlaid box that I've still got. Anyway, so that was my little story of Sinai. But Sinai is real. Whether everything that the Bible says about Sinai took place exactly like that is a matter of interpretation, but Sinai is real, so that it's there. Maybe different names, Horeb, or different kind of names, and nobody, of course, is sure it's a mountain range. It's not like Stone Mountain, one mountain out here. It's a range of the Rockies, that kind of stuff. But anyway, so that is another of the Bibles of the mountains in the Bible. Yeah, they led him to the river. The Spirit of God led them. Well, you can't get too picky with that. You let's don't try to figure that out. How deep was the Jordan? Could he walk across? No, this no, no, that's just the story. Uh, that and it's all part of the story in there that Moses was the spiritual leader and then Joshua becomes the military leader, and it is Joshua who leads them into the promised land, Jericho and conquering the promised land, and all. That is the way that saga unfolds. But Moses, for reasons that we don't know, you can never figure it out, was not allowed to go into the promised land. And he stood up on Mount Nebo and looked across. And you can go up on Mount Nebo and you can look across the Jordan River way down there, and you're looking at Jericho or somewhere like that down in there.
What does history say that Moses was not allowed to go into?
What now?
What does history say? Reason that Moses was not.
Well, history does not deal with that. That is really beyond history. That is a theological or spiritual or biblical kind of thing. But the Bible says that Moses was not allowed to go in because he did not get water from the rock exactly like God had told him to do it. So you really can't do history with that. You can't do history like we do that. Uh, it just doesn't work that way. This is another one of the great stories, uh, one of the great myths in the good sense of the word. Uh, but that whole saga there of the Israelites leaving Egypt is what is the founding story of Judaism. And that is the story that they tell again and again and again.
May I sit in with you? Is that okay?
Sure, yes, yeah. Pull up a chair. Please do. Here,
Well, I get my very own coffee.
here. Yeah,
Thank you.
we have plenty. So that we have done Ararat and the ark, and now we've done Sinai and Moses and the Ten Commandments. Okay. The other one that I forgot about that I'll just mention in passing that's not on the list is what's called Mount Moriah, and that is allegedly in the biblical story the mountain where Abraham was directed to go with Isaac, with the idea that God was telling Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. That's one of the great famous stories, uh, and they call that Mount Moriah. And then the legend that has unfolded across the centuries is that Mount Moriah is also the site of Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Now, that's a big story. Uh, many years ago, I was able to go with an eminent professor to that, and we were able to go up on Temple Mount, and we went to the Dome of the Rock. You've seen the pictures looking across the Golden Dome of the Rock. Inside the mosque, the Golden Dome of the Rock, is a huge boulder, huge rock. And that supposedly is the rock on which Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac when God stopped him and gave him a lamb or gave him a sheep, a goat, or something, not to do that. But that is also the rock from which Muhammad, the story is Muhammad was dying. I don't know all of these. And he flew on a horse. He flew on a winged horse from Saudi Arabia, wherever he was down in there, to this rock in Jerusalem. And you know, and it was from that rock then that Muhammad ascended into heaven. So that's why Temple Mount is so incredibly important to Christians, Jews, and Muslims. That's the story. Uh, it's in the old city. It's in the old city. No, it's just part of Jerusalem. Of course, these days um, they've fought so much and the borders have changed so much, but it's Temple Mount, and you see pictures of the wall where they stand and pray. The wall there is all that is left of Herod's great temple that the Romans destroyed in 70 BC, 70 CE, in 70 Common Era. The Jews rebelled, and the Romans finally came in and burned the city of Jerusalem and burned the temple, which is a terrible travesty. And all that's left of that huge complex is that wall. It's called the Wailing Wall, where the Jews stand and pray. Uh, and you when they were not fighting so much, you could climb the steps and go up there. And on one end is the Dome of the Rock, and on the other end is the El Aqsa Mosque, which is a huge mosque. So the Temple Mount, the top of that whole thing, belongs to the Muslims, but it's in Jerusalem, and they accommodate each other in ways in which I don't understand much to go. But right now, I don't think Jews can go up on the top. They're fighting so much that I don't think the Jews can go up there. When I was there in about 85 or 6, as Americans, we could go up on Temple Mount. I'm not sure whether even then the Jews could go up on Temple Mount, but that's there. I mean, it was a mount. It was a big hill, and the first and second temple, so-called Solomon's temple, and then Herod's temple, were built on that mount. It's a hill. It's not a mountain. It's just a hill. That whole area is hilly, real hilly. Uh, so anyway, that's there. But that's Mount Moriah, another piece of it. The next one that I look at is Mount Gilboa. Uh, by then, and a lot of stuff had happened and so forth. By then, Saul was the king. Saul was the first king of the Jews, of the Hebrews. Long story there. Saul, head and shoulders, must have been a beautiful man. I think Saul was a real character. If everything that we talk about Saul may not be absolutely historical, may be more poetic, but I think Saul had a birthday. Saul was a real person. Uh, he was king. One of my favorite scholars says that you get the idea he was king of the whole region, but probably not. He wound up being king of a small part of that world there. But anyway, he's considered to be the king. But Saul turned out to be not a very good administrator. Beautiful creature, beautiful man. He quickly ran afoul of God. Uh, God told Saul and his troops to go to the village of Ai, and destroy it all. And Saul went in there and destroyed everything, but he kept a few. Here we go. He kept a few pieces of livestock, a few head of livestock, to offer as a sacrifice to God, to Yahweh. But because Saul did not destroy, this is the way the Bible tells it, because Saul did not destroy it all, then God got mad at him and said, "You won't be king anymore." Well, but the way it all plays out, Saul was not a very able king. Finally came to a big battle with Saul and the people of Israel, the army of Israel, probably a few thousand, and the Philistines. The Israelites and the Philistines fought each other for hundreds of years. The irony of that is, even though the Philistines were enemies of the Israelites, Palestine, the name Palestine, is a derivative from Philistine, from Philistia. Palestinians, Philistia, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so, but the final big battle was on Gilboa. And Saul and Jonathan and his other son were were defeated by the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. Jonathan and the other son, whose name I forget, were killed in battle, killed outright in battle. Uh, and then when Saul saw the battle going against him, Saul turned to his armor bearer and says, I want you to run me through. I want you to take my life. I want you to push the sword in that will take my life. I will not be alive. I will not be taken alive. And the armor bearer said, my king, I will not do that. I won't do that. So Saul fell on his own sword, took his own life. And then the story is the armor bearer promptly also took his life. Uh, and so Saul and Jonathan and the other brother were killed. Apparently, Jonathan and David had a great love for each other. And one of the beautiful lamentations in the Bible is the poem, the poet that David sang when he learned of the death of Jonathan. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece there. And that took place on Mount Gilboa. And there is a Gilboa. Whether the stuff that we have in the Bible took place exactly like that, Mount Gilboa is a real mountain. It's still there. I mean, it's still there. Okay. Saul died. Saul and his two sons died on Mount Gilboa in battle. The other one that we get to is Mount Zion. Uh, Mount Zion is very pervasive in the Hebrew Bible. Uh, Jerusalem is an ancient site. Jerusalem is on a hill. Jerusalem, the hill on which Jerusalem was originally founded in far distant antiquity, came to be called Mount Zion. Zion is a Hebrew word. I don't forget what it means, but it's a derivative of a Hebrew word. So Mount Zion is the hill on which the ancient village of Jebus was founded. Uh, and the archaeologists have founded signs of human life on Jebus for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And it was a fortress. It could be protected. And so the people who lived there could be protected there. The way the Bible tells the story, David wanted, as he became king, at least a part of the country, David wanted Jebus to be his capital city. And he tried and tried and tried to take the city, but he always got beat. The people, it was so well fortified that he couldn't do it. But the other story, it's a fascinating story. Uh, Somebody, again, I should look that up. Somebody let David know that there is uh, a water tunnel. Here the city was fortified. They had to get water, and so in antiquity they say they dug a tunnel, a water chute from the top up here down to a spring, down through the mountains down to the spring. And that way, within the fortifications of the city of Jebus, they could get water. Big deal. David, the story, it's a great story. David's heard about that, and David commissioned or persuaded two or three of his hardy soldiers to scale. They could get into the spring down here, and they could shimmy themselves up through this water tunnel to the city. And they did that by night and got into the city and opened the gates. And David was able to go in and take the city. And eventually, another long story, it became Jerusalem, which became, in the way the Bible tells it, David's capital city. Every now and then, some archaeologist declares that he's found this water tunnel. I don't know that that they'll ever find it, but it's a good story. But anyway, Mount Zion. So uh, now, I mean, through the way the Bible tells the story, a lot of times Mount Zion comes to represent not the city, but the whole idea of Israel. And the Psalms sing often of Mount Zion um, as a way to kind of gather up the whole Israelite, the whole Jewish Hebrew experience. So Mount Zion, and it's shifted around. The walls have moved back and forth through the centuries, um, and now Mount Zion, what people say is Mount Zion, is actually outside of the old city. What Lynn was asking about the old city, but it the mountain hasn't moved. The walls have moved. They've moved the walls, but Mount Zion is a big part. That's another of the mountains. Okay. We talk about high places um, from antiquity, different groups, different tribes, and whatever would there would be a hill out here, a hill out here. Uh, and Rita is talking with Sammy one day, and Rita says, I was my grandfather told me that he was up on that hill one night and he saw an angel come. So Rita says, my grandfather tells me that story. So then Rita tells Sammy, but she fails to say, she says, there's an angel that comes down there. So then Sammy says, that's a great idea. So Sammy then tells Lynn, and Lynn then, 300 years later, decides that that hill is sacred. And then we come along there, and Joanne comes out there, and to mark the hill, this is 400 or 500 years later, she puts up a pole like a totem pole. Think about the Indians, the totem pole. And so it is a high place with poles. And this is to say that for decades that people have told the story that that God or the gods or angels or somebody comes to that high place. The prophets come along, Amos, Hosea, one of them, and complaining because the people are still going out to the high places and worshiping around those poles. This is biblical. And so the prophet said, go out there and chop down all those poles. Clean up. You got to be worshiping God alone, Yahweh alone. You can't still have those high places. Okay, but that high places it talked about from time to time in the Bible. Another famous mountain is Mount Carmel, another big mountain range. It's not a single mountain; it is a mountain range, and it's still designated Carmel. Uh, the famous part of Carmel is the episode between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. A long story that we won't go into, but finally, Elijah, the great prophet of Yahweh, and Ahab and Jezebel were the king and queen of Israel, of the country, of the kingdom of Israel. And Jezebel worshipped Baal, Baal, Baal or Baal. Uh, and the story in the book of Kings, one of the kings, says that Elijah challenged them. Uh, Elijah had already announced to King Ahab that because they were worshiping Baal, that a drought would take over the land. And so 3 years, 5 years, some extended period of time, a drought settled over the land, bringing great pain and disaster. Uh, so finally, Elijah and Ahab and Jezebel meet, and the Bible says, on Mount Carmel. And that's when they have the big contest. Um, Elijah tells the prophets of Baal to slaughter a bull and put pieces of the bull on this altar and prayed to Baal for fire to come down and consume the ox as a sacrifice. And the Bible is very colorful in telling how frenzied the prophets of Baal came, and yet the fire did not fall. Uh, Elijah, then, it's a great story, says, okay, let's start all over again. Tear the whole thing down. Elijah builds a new altar, kills a new bull, pours water all around, digs a trench around, water everywhere to make sure that there was no trickery going on. And then the Bible says that Elijah prayed to Yahweh, and the fire fell and destroyed, consumed uh, the uh, the bull that had been sacrificed, ate up all of the rocks, lapped up all the water. Yeah, it's a fascinating story. And then, just to make sure that everything was in order, Elijah had all the prophets of Baal murdered. So, 900 prophets of Baal were murdered that day in the way the story is told. So don't mess with Elijah. You'll get in bad trouble if you get crossed up with Elijah. Great story, and I say in here that all of us young preachers have preached sermons from that. It's a fascinating, rich, multifaceted story. Was Elijah a real character? Could well have been. I don't know whether fire fell from heaven and burned up the sacrifice. I don't know that part. But anyway, but again, Mount Carmel, and the book says that Carmel is still known as Carmel. There's a monastery up there. There's a hospice up there. It's supposed to be a real lush part where olives and grapes and all kind of stuff grow there. It's a part of Galilee, part of Israel. Quickly, Mount Calvary, where Jesus was crucified. Uh, uh, the Bible says that there was a site outside of the city walls where the Romans crucified people who had been convicted of crimes. Readily understand that it didn't take much to get crucified. One historian says that a Roman soldier, a Roman corporal, not a centurion, but a corporal, had the power to condemn somebody to be crucified with no recourse. They could say, okay, Sammy did it, string him up. Sammy's done. No recourse. Everybody could complain and cry, and still Sammy gets crucified. So, where is Mount Carmel? And what the Bible tells it was outside of the city walls. But there we know that the city walls have changed across the centuries. So now there are two sites in that little part of the world there that people say are at Mount Calvary. Uh, One is, it's really eerie, and I did this. I stood up on the wall that is there now. This was 30, 40 years ago. And there is a rock formation up here that looks like a skull. And so some people say that is Calvary, Golgotha, the skull up there. The other is along the way, the walls were extended, and what people say is Mount Calvary is now inside the city walls and is now inside of an ancient church building, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is run by Orthodox Christians, one branch of Christianity, and Catholicism. When I was there these many, many years ago, the building was in terrible repair. It's a grim, nasty, huge building that is not maintained because three groups who claim they own it would not take care of it. that's a long time ago. It might be better now. I haven't, of course, I haven't been back in a long time. The interesting piece of all of that is when Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, decided he was going to become a Christian, which is another old story, that his mother, the Empress Theodosia, forget her name, she went to the Holy Land. She went to Palestine, it was, in the early 300s, and she designated, because she was the empress, she said, this is Calvary, this is where he was born, this is the water, she spent time there and designated with her power as the emperor's mother to settle all these places. And she, with whoever helped her, decided that this particular place was where Jesus was crucified. Uh, and then in time, it was the walls were extended, and the site, the supposed site where Jesus died, was brought in. I mean, the walls embraced it, and a big church building was built over it. I think there's no doubt that Jesus died. I think that he was crucified in Jerusalem, where nobody knows. One place is probably as good as another, but that's where that is. And it was decided by the empress and probably others helping her that these different places, sites are where these kind of biblical events took place. And the last one that we look at quickly is or two more real quickly, we have time, is the Mount of Olives. I mean, the Mount of Olives. It's a place outside the city walls. No, let me back up a minute. I'm overlooking the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. The book of Matthew says Jesus went up on a mountain and delivered the Sermon on the Mount. Don't know where that is. In Matthew, it's a Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, it's a Sermon in the Valley. So, it doesn't matter, but they both are essentially the same recitation by Jesus when Jesus gathered them together and said, I've come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And so he reinterpreted the prophet and the Torah and all of that in what we have come to call the Beatitudes. Blessed are those. And so that it is best known as the Sermon on the Mount. Where that is, nobody knows. I can imagine it on a hillside overlooking the Galilee Lake, over a hillside looking Lake Lanier out here, beautiful sight with several hundred people gathered around while he did the Sermon on the Mount. It's every reason to believe that something like that happened. It may have happened more than once, but the Beatitudes are such echoes from that early time that many scholars think that we have real echoes of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. That probably was done in what we would say 29, the book of Matthew written in 90. So you've got a lot of years between whatever Jesus said and whatever Matthew and Luke wrote down, but it's still good echoes there. That's the Sermon on the Mount. The other one is the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor. That's another biblical story. Jesus, in the way the Bible tells it, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him up onto this mountain. And the way the Bible tells it, Jesus was transfigured. That in the story, Moses and Elijah came to Jesus. And the way the Gospels tell it, that this is the affirmation of God, Yahweh Adonai, that Jesus is the Messiah. So it's a beautiful sight. Mount Tabor is a real sight. It's a mountain range still, I mean, to say that it's still there, it's still there. I mean, it's still known as Mount Tabor, a very sacred spot, site of many pilgrimages as Christians from around the world go to the Holy Land. They always want to go up Mount Tabor to the Mount of Transfiguration. So quickly, Mount of Olives. Mount of Olives is a hillside outside the walls of Jerusalem. In Jesus' day, apparently, many olive trees, olive groves grew there. But eventually, that whole site of the Mount of Olives became a burial ground, a Jewish burial ground, particularly for Jewish elite. Not just any Jew could be buried out there, but there was some kind of pecking order, I suppose, whereby a Jew got to be buried there. And archaeologists have, with some reason, have said that something like that, wherever that is, they can find remnants of about 150,000 burial sites, graves on that hillside out there. Jewish people, parenthetically, you die today and they bury you tomorrow. The Jewish people do not embalm. I learned this when I was living among the Jews in Maryland the last couple of years. Uh, you die today, and then a group of people, usually, whether it's maybe if it's a woman that died, I don't know, but there's a group of people, group of Jewish people whose special calling is to prepare the body, the corpse for burial. And there's a ritual bathing for all of that. But they do not embalm. And so you're buried, if they possibly can, the next day. A lot of Muslims do the same thing. So you die and you're buried the next day. I remember when, yes,
Excuse me,
yeah,
I think the reason that they bury too sweet, so to speak, is because they get stinking after such a short time in that atmosphere, in that uh, in that climate.
yeah,
Even today, the Jewish people bury you the next day. That's tradition.
yeah,
But from a practical standpoint, the Jews bury them if they could, and because of the deterioration of the body.
yeah. And they bury simply, they bury in a wooden box. Uh, you know, we get the metal and we get the copper and all that kind of good stuff because some other we want the body to last forever.
Except Jesus.
The Jews are ready, dust thou art, to dust returneth. So they very lovingly prepare the body and bury it typically in a wooden casket. And then a few days later, they would have a memorial service like we do now. When I die, I'll be cremated. Um, and then a few weeks later, they'll have thousands gathered for a memorial service for me. But I would have already been cremated and my ashes disposed of in some kind of way. So, in my experience in Bethesda, we had 2 or 3 Jewish friends to die, and they were buried the next day or as quickly as they could. And then a few days later, we had a memorial service. But that's their custom to bury quickly like that.
Buried like in the same cemetery.
You think about Jewish cemeteries, yes, a Jewish park.
Buried. The wooden box dissolves.
Yeah, they don't do vaults and stuff like we do. No, they don't do all that stuff. Concrete, no, they bury the box. From what I know.
Because today are pushing for more green burial.
Right. Yeah.
Because two of my friends had a green burial,
Yeah.
and they weren't Jews.
Right.
But they owned a lot of land.
How were they buried? In a box or just in a shroud?
Box.
In a pine box. Yeah. Yeah. I like that idea. That's why I will be cremated. I don't want to take up the ground. I don't want to think about I'm under the ground that long either. That's kind of spooky to me.
Or hang around.
Uh, anyway, the Mount of Olives, the site of the Mount of Olives, in the way the book of Acts tells it, the opening chapter of the book of Acts, Jesus has kind of come and gone. It's a fascinating piece there. And anyway, he sends word to his disciples to meet him on the Mount of Olives. And on the Mount of Olives, he gives his final orders, go into all the world, Jerusalem, the Syria and all that. And then it's from the Mount of Olives that the Bible says Jesus ascended into heaven. So that's the Mount of Olives. So fascinating stories there. The mountains are there. Exactly what, where, when, why happened is a matter of conjecture, matter of faith, matter of statement, matter of what you want to say. Uh, but through all of them, there is the Israelite, the Jewish, the Hebrew idea of the grace of God, the power of God, but also the grace of God. All of that is told beautifully in those stories. And